Over the course of this series, we have looked at everything from wacky tank concepts to tanks that were used in active service. Up until now though, I have never gone into the world of fictional tank designs unless they were directly linked to a vehicle I was doing a video on. Even in the case of the tank concepts, which can be argued to be fictional, they were still intended to be used in a combat role. Today's vehicle of choice is quite the opposite, however, with it being intended only as entertainment in the form of a comic series. Not only that, but this tank is truly cursed, with it being known as the Haunted Tank. Before we get into the video, I want to be honest with all of you watching this. I have not actually read the entire series of comics which today's tank is from. However, this does not prevent me from being able to look at the tank design within its pages. For the sake of the vast majority who, like myself, have not read the comics, I will briefly summarize the basic plot. If you notice any blurring made to portions of the images, this is because I don't want to take any chances with YouTube, and this series does contain both Nazi and Confederate flags. I dislike having to censor things like that, so I will be uploading an uncensored version to Odyssey, but I'd rather not have this video blacklisted over something unimportant to the actual discussion. Anyways, on to the summary. The story of these comics follow the crew of a Stuart tank under the command of a sergeant named Jeb Stuart. The remainder of the crew is made up of the childhood friends of Stuart as they begin their fighting in North Africa and eventually the European theater. Over the course of the series, the crew use several different tanks, but we'll get to those in just a moment. What separates this from any other story of a tank crew is something that made me have to actually double take when I first read it. A dead Confederate general, who is the ancestor of Jeb Stuart, named James Earl Brown Stuart, begins haunting the tank after being sent by the spirit of Alexander the Great. He continues to watch over the crew, although can only communicate with Jeb, so the crew is obviously a little weirded out by that fact. In honor of the ghost protecting his tank though, Jeb flies the Confederate flag. This ghostly protector continues to follow them as they lose several Stuarts, eventually constructing the tank we'll be focusing on today, known as the Jigsaw tank. Later on, the crew moves to a Sherman, causing the ghost of William T. Sherman to be assigned to the tank, with General Stuart looking on still. This series was actually revived later in 2008 for a short run where the ghost of General Stuart returns and acts as a guardian for a younger Stuart named Jamal and haunts an M1 Abrams in Afghanistan. The tank even appears in one issue of Batman the Brave and the Bold, where it helps Batman fight Key. Not going to lie, I'm pretty upset we haven't seen a movie or TV series of this, because to me that would be incredible. Unfortunately, I get the feeling that's unlikely to happen due to the inclusion of a Confederate general, which would more than likely get more backlash than breathing the wrong way on Twitter. Regardless, I'll definitely have to read through this series when I get the chance, because just looking at some of the cover art, it's absolutely wild. As I'm not a film and comic-centered channel though, I will save that for another day and instead look at the design of the crew's Jigsaw tank. Thankfully, the comics actually give us a beautiful overview of exactly what this tank is made of, with only some minor things left out. First, we can take a look at the design of the vehicle, and then afterwards, I think it would be interesting to consider how this vehicle would fare on an actual battlefield. The hull is from a Russian T-34, modified to have a Christie suspension and a coaxial 20mm cannon. Powering this monstrosity is a 500 horsepower 12-cylinder Russian V2 12-cylinder diesel engine, allowing the tank a top speed of 21 miles per hour or 33 kilometers per hour. Unfortunately, we aren't told what the turret comes from, so unless it's mentioned within one of the comics, it seems to be just a made-up one. As for the gun though, we see that it's equipped with a 76.2mm cannon as well as the Browning 50 on the roof. One thing I noticed about the design, which was possibly overlooked by the original creators of the comic, was the choice to swap the idler and drive sprocket of the T-34. I get the feeling this was done more without realizing it would require the transmission to be moved up front along with it, but regardless, it has a major impact on the design's viability. Speaking of which, now that we've looked over the design, let's take a deeper dive and consider the real-life viability of such a vehicle. Before we can even discuss the tank itself, we need to try and place what part of the war the vehicle is being used in. This is because a tank that's effective for the battlefield of, say, 1940 would be virtually useless for frontline service even just a few years later. Now bear in mind, this is a massive oversimplification, but I think you can understand what I'm getting at. Back to the tank in question, we can assume that it's being used at some point during the late war period, as the comics follow the events in North Africa and then Europe, meaning it must be after Operation Torch, which happened in late 1942. Looking at the scenery depicted in the first issue that the Jigsaw tank appears in, I think it's safe to assume we're looking at a time period of sometime in 1944 or later. This is also confirmed by the fact that Cromwell's appear in the issue. So what does all this mean for our tank? Surprisingly, it actually helps it out considerably. When I initially was working on this video, I was a little confused by how the Americans would wind up with a T-34 hull, but considering it was most likely found in a tank graveyard in Europe rather than Africa, it's still unlikely, but at least plausible. As for the actual specs of the tank, although not the best, they are certainly not bad. With a 76mm cannon, the tank would be better armed than most Allied tanks at that point, allowing it to engage German tanks at greater range. For the battlefield of 1944, the T-34 armor of 45mm is a bit lacking, but considering the crew was moving up from a Stuart, the armor would still be an improvement. With T-34-85s in the Eastern Front still using the same armor at that point as well, it was obviously still viable for a tank. The mobility is a bit of a mixed bag for me because the speed the comic gives of 21 miles per hour is considerably slower than the true top speed of the T-34, which was closer to 32. This could possibly be explained by the changes to the hull and turret increasing the weight of the tank. Although I'd like to increase that speed based on the real-life facts, since we are reviewing the tank as it is described to us, we'll have to assume that this is the true maximum speed. Despite that, the mobility of the tank would still be acceptable given the power-to-weight ratio, allowing the tank to accelerate quickly even though the top speed is subpar. Now that we've gone over some of the good portions of the design, I want to move into some of the issues I find with it. First and foremost is the supposed front-mounted transmission. As most of you likely already know, T-34s are not exactly known for their crew comfort, but this would only be made worse by cramming a transmission into the front of the tank. How the 20mm cannon with its gunner and the driver with all his instruments would fit is beyond me. The next part of the design I'm curious about would be the turret. It almost appears to be a mix of a Chaffee turret and the mantlet from a later model Sherman. Obviously, much of the strange shape can be explained away by the fact that it's a comic and things are often drawn with wacky proportions, but it can't solve the issue of still needing to be spacious enough for the crew. Again, looking at the T-34-85, we see that a larger turret and armament was possible on the T-34, although I question if the custom turret would be large enough for the gun to be loaded with at least 2 crew still on the turret. All of these are nitpicks though when we consider the most major issue with this tank, that being lack of spare parts. Considering all the factors in the design, I think it's safe to say the Jigsaw tank would function reasonably well for the real-life battlefield in 1944 or 45. However, as we can see from numerous examples, particularly with German tanks, that matters very little if you can't fix the tank when it breaks down. By utilizing a Russian-built engine, this tank is pretty much just a ticking time bomb waiting to have a breakdown. I suppose it's possible the crew could rig together some sort of fix given time or use a different engine, but this could very quickly cause more issues with cooling or other parts of the drivetrain. For a temporary solution though, which this tank obviously is, I see no reason it wouldn't work other than the aforementioned transmission placement. Keep in mind that as I haven't read the full series, there could be things I missed, or I could even be wrong about where the tank was assembled originally or even the time period it was built. If you're older and remember reading this series back when it was published in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and have corrections, please leave a comment below and correct me. So, do you agree with my opinion on this tank? Let me know down in the comments and let me know what you thought of this video. I would like to possibly do more fake tanks from comics, TV, movies, and video games similar to this video, so if you would like to see that, do let me know. Like I said earlier, I'll have to read through the Haunted Tank series because I'm hooked by what I read during the research of this video. I certainly by no means expected any of what I read when I first came across the name of the series when searching for the topic for this video. That's enough for today's video though. Thanks as always to my ConelyFans who support the channel through their YouTube membership, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.